Thank you. Clearly, we have three nicely contrasting takes on how we think of making what is spontaneous and extemporized visible and organized, I guess, from our speakers. Well, people are thinking, if anyone wants to kind of press an immediate button on a question, say, otherwise I'll just kick off myself maybe just to ask people just to juxtapose a little bit about what was said by each other in turn. I suppose almost starting with Yaoping, you talked about the Chongqing, the villages in the city, villages in the city, in a way living their own, going through their own life, right? I mean, which is, their own life is partly something that, I guess, that they are autonomous but not creatures of complete autonomy, right? So I was wondering about that appeal to going through your own life of these particular forms of urban development implies spontaneity in some registers, but on the other hand they imply also other surrounding kinds of intervention, which then, I suppose, going back to Malik's always incredibly evocative talks, one of the more beautiful things he said is he talked about, I think I wrote down that about the substrata of all urban productivity being simultaneously its detractor, which seems to me a very powerful description of something, but I suppose it's an evocation of something that is happening and something that is nicely ambivalent about what is happening. I was wondering about then what that means, almost in a similar but slightly different fashion from the autonomy of the lives of the urban villages in terms of thinking about the good city and an analytical gaze that is recognizing the plurality of what is there, but also opening up something about what is happening, which I suppose comes back in turn to Sue's notions of tensions between what is negotiable and not negotiable in the spontaneous city. So I suppose I just encourage while people are thinking about questions, maybe just come back, maybe almost in that order, if that makes sense, about a little bit about just what those forms of spontaneity as defined mean in the context of the boundaries, the possibilities and the limits in a way. Yaoping, do you want to start maybe Malik and then we'll open up a bit.
Yeah, I think in China it's quite interesting. The people emphasize about the migration. It's the same as in China. Suddenly, people began to migrate. And I looked at the history of China. Actually, since the communists taking power, the first major population movement is the Korea War. Almost every village, young people joined the army. And so that's the first round of movement. And then you got to this setting down urban youth to the rural area. And in the late 1970s, you got this big push for agricultural irrigation system. All the farmers actually migrate to other villages where the irrigation system is, so they can just have very simple sleeping places. I think that's a kind of large-scale people always seems moving, which probably also is one of the great pictures for the migration. I think about the boundary thing in the urban villages, you can see that with the land system, the village used to have the village itself and large agricultural land. The government taking over the land, so that means the village boundary is gradually smaller and smaller. So they lost all the production activities, and so they push that sense up. So the horizontal becomes smaller, the spatial they push it up. And also each village was normally given a bit of land for local business development. That is for the industrial production. So I think the space is always dynamic, and the case in I feel the urban village redevelopment argument is initially when the village was developed, the developers are not interested in the village. They want agricultural land that's cheap, it's easy to use. But when the city grew bigger and bigger, all the land is gone. And the developer, the government, looking back, try to find new opportunities. So the traditional village say, oh, that is not orderly planned, healthy, hazard, they needed to be redeveloped. But I think the argument is only one side, and the main argument is the economic profit the land could produce, actually. I think a lot of the boundaries or these things are defined by the economic ideas of the market as well. I don't know if I see.
Okay, thank you.
No, I mean, it seems a key problematic is within urban regions that have historically long been governed through multiple sovereignties, not just in terms of territory, but in terms of the definition and boundaries of institutions themselves. To what extent does the kinds of preconditionalities that Sue is talking about that enable particular kinds of scaling and maneuverability have some kind of traction? How do they really implant themselves in? Because what I'm talking about in some ways is a kind of participatory economy that in some way coagulates and hardens sometimes, and which oftentimes results in kinds of violence to break through, to reshape itself. And must it always entail a kind of violence as an enabling force? And so I'm wondering, in terms of Sue, your comments, and in terms also the urban villages. Here was an example of multiple sovereignties at work, multiple regimes of land ownership that, in some ways, became fortuitous, because within a kind of larger Chinese context that, at least on the surface, couldn't risk failure. The urban villages became that context that could productively absorb failure. And if you look at the history of Shenzhen's efficacy is largely built on the fact that failure was something that could be played with in some way. The villages absorbed that. It was like trying things, didn't work, different forms of state-owned enterprises, didn't work, start again, compensate. And I think what's happening in some sense globally is that the tolerance for failure, the ability to fail, the window is rapidly shrinking. Failure costs more now than it ever has before. The stakes are higher. And given that, the kind of flexibility that people have in terms of trying things out also has become it becomes a kind of homogenizing thing. You buy into particular ways of life, particular ways of managing your situation, which even though you know in the long run doesn't work for you, somehow it's like a kind of cushion against the debilitating prospects of failure.
I suppose just to push a little bit and then come back, does it lead into Sue's thing? Is there a point when the complexity of the self-governing system, is there a point when its complexity becomes an alibi for non-intervention?
Yeah. No, I mean this kind of complexity continues to provide a kind of arena for small attainments.
Yeah.
But the entanglements sometimes get so thick that that's what I'm saying, they kind of coagulate in these kind of particular kinds of forms. And sometimes when you need a kind of breakthrough, it's difficult a complex weave is important, but it's also important to be able to know how to undo it so that you can think about different ways of doing it. Right now I see in many kinds of popular districts an inability to unweave except through very violent and kinds of abruptive maneuvers.
See?
Yeah, I don't know how you responded to these incredibly different entry points, and I think that's really quite useful. So, but for me, the glue, if you like, or the provocation that the collective presentation sort of generated was it invokes for me the fervour of the debate about modernity in the mid-20th century and the tensions that were really around that, about kind of new forms of expression and control and opportunity, possibility on the one hand, and these incredibly restrictive moments of regulation and intervention and repression. And I think it's this discussion about that which is really that's what struck me, from whether you're talking about the space for the individual and the space for the village in this much bigger framing. And Michael, I like your question about what are the mechanisms which kind of hold these complex dynamics and these complex systems together. And I think one of the things which was so interesting is that we each fingered very different kinds of actors. And I don't think it's a case of any one of them was right or wrong. Whether it's the people, the community, however framed, or some form of the state. But clearly kind of an uncertainness about kind of either what its role is in mediating this very difficult process of urbanisation. And what I don't think that we got collectively was how they sit together. But I thought that between us there were some really interesting issues raised about the sort of the interplay between individuals, households, communities and the state, and the way that perhaps speaks to these sort of bigger collective things. I mean, I was really struck when you were talking, I think, about, what happens with the village in China is, you scale that up and it starts to be a dynamic which is not really about the city, actually. It's not even about the nation. But if you think of it, it's sort of, for me, it's almost the rise and transformation of the Chinese village system is perhaps the symbol of our transformation into a very different kind of global practice and reality, and you were saying that. So I absolutely took that. But I suppose for me, I would come back to this thing of saying we've got to be much clearer ourselves about what we can and should be mediating, because it's very clear that some of this urban process has to be mediated, and what it's possible to mediate. And the dangers associated with that mediation, the violence that you allude to. But for me, there's violence in not mediating. The failure to protect is as bad as the violence of oppression.
Okay, let's open up. We've got a couple of questions lined up. I've got 1, 2, and 3. 4 actually, I think. So let's take them in pairs. We'll go 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4 at the back, if that's okay. So.
Thanks for the great papers. So Malika, the phrase I latched onto was the ideology of the streets, perhaps an evolution of people as infrastructure, and I think it clearly has a kind of meaningful and intentional tension within it, which for me meant that from, I guess, like a traditional Weberian sense, ideology is a byproduct of institutionalization. So I guess to link to Sue, in that sense, at what point do the subjects of informality, informals, institutionalize their understanding of that term? And I say this because in my research, for example, people who are stealing homes have adopted the Arabic term for informality, ashwa'i, to mean of kind of practical expertise. And explicitly uses to leverage real tangible gains in the law, at least the law of private gated communities. So, yeah, I guess when does ideology of the street also when does informality become, I guess, an ideology in of itself, or a term that people start to label themselves as proudly?
Okay, why don't we'll go back to Alex, and then Beth, I think, behind.
Thanks everyone for some really fascinating papers, and I think maybe my question is partly about trying to think across the papers as well around the question which I think runs through the conference more generally, which is about, I think my allergies are starting to kick in with the warm weather, which is about kind of conceptual unruliness in thinking about cities, and whether that is something we need to accommodate, or is that something, because I think some of the questions that Sue began with were at least pushing in a direction which challenges some of the debates in geography and urban studies around how we make concepts, and I'm quite interested in the making of concepts as well. And so it was just something that runs across those papers, is a kind of more normative question about where does the good city sit within a debate about concept making. So I know that's probably a question we can't answer immediately, but it's just something that I've been thinking about in the context of some really wonderful papers. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to come back on these two first, then we'll get to come. Who wants to start? I guess just start. And then
the ideology of the street. No, I mean what I'm trying to suggest is that in some ways these kinds of venues, such as the street or the market or the have always been characterized by sort of metaphors of a kind of imagination, a kind of resilience, kind of creativity, they come almost from nowhere in some way. What I want to suggest is that they employ very, very, very elaborated and specific forms of figuration, of calculating, of what you pay attention to, how you decide, how you negotiate, particular kinds of rules, particular kinds of ways of thinking about the spaces in which you're in. And so the street becomes almost a kind of institution as well, with particular kinds of effective loyalties, particular ways of situating oneself, of identifying, of proclaiming, and yeah. So this is, in some ways, this is what I'm trying to get at in that concept.
No, you happy?
I think what I try to say is not to standardize spontaneous ideas across the world. Cultural, local, economic, political influence is quite important. The Pearl River Delta region, the urban villages, is quite different from what you find in Beijing. And for example, the Shenzhen area, families used to build higher and higher, and other places they can't. The reason is because the local politics in Shenzhen initially is rural dominant. Because the village become urbanized, the local politicians, the local government have quite large rural elements in it. So they just control it half-heartedly. The family just keep doing it. But when you go to Beijing, you don't find anything higher than 3 stories because the government is so strong-handed. If you get anything higher, you will be demolished. The only time when the visibility relax is around the Beijing Olympics. And we thought the Olympics destroyed many villages. But the study I did is actually during the Olympic period, before it and immediately after. There's quite a lot of relaxation on control of the local villages because they don't want the villagers to do any demonstration or anything. So the village on site was demolished, but all the other villages using that gap of political relaxation to build. And of course, when Cecilia was talking about this year, they used the argument to clear the urban villages because of fire, and they demolished many of the villages. So the local politics and the local economic combination is a quite important feature that produces different kinds of spontaneous development. But the common thing is a spontaneous development everywhere, but they are different.
I was present in a meeting once in Shenzhen where the chief planner said that 90% of all of the buildings in the villages were technically illegal. That then creates a dialogue, right? As well as which I think is interesting. The dialogue begins the process, right?
Yeah, and maybe that's the best way to come back to Nick. I think so for me, what's really fascinating is the formalization route and the codification route. But within that, for me, the tricky part is who assumes power at different phases. And one of the things I find really irritating about a lot of the literature which deals with settlements that are uncodified is there's an assumption that there is no power. And that somehow it is only when there are state regulations, which are often very inappropriate, that somehow then power is exercised. And so my favourite example of this is the situation of traditional tenure in Africa, where women simply don't have access to it and are excluded from it. So, so I think kind of tracking that and watching the processes through which that happens, not with the notion of a hierarchy or a progression to some optimal state, because I think it's exactly what's so interesting about that, but rather about how do you ensure that at all times and for all generations you're creating something that has a positive value is for me, and you're not excluding is the useful thing to do. So in that. But then Alex, on the question of concept formation, I'm so out of my terrain. Those who are trained philosophically will just kind of find some of what I'm saying really difficult, or naive. But for me, what's awkward at the moment for us as urbanists is that I think there has rightfully been a disruption of a set of fairly hegemonic ways of reading the city and metrics of reading the city. And the fact that has been ruptured is completely appropriate. The tricky part is that in reassembling that, we've chosen a moment when the city is changing so fast, when the cities that we are looking at are growing exponentially, and when the community that looks at the city, who has to have this dialogue, is unbelievably diverse. And I think what's happened in that process is that where there has not been a common language, we have been unruly, but we haven't been able to understand the unruly city any better. But we've also been sloppy. And I think that that's the difficulty that we face. So I don't think sloppy is a great philosophical term, or normal, but we've been sloppy. And I don't know that we can account for ourselves. And what really worries me is that at the moment where the agglomeration of the urban condition, the stuff that you were talking about, where our collective impact from living in the way that we do begins to really matter, we are unable to actually speak to why and how, and therefore I think it's very difficult for us to make meaningful interventions. So yeah, I look forward to those of you who have more robust conceptual abilities to design.
I've got Beth here, and then do you want to come in at this point? Beth, do you want to? I think there's a microphone just worth making its way to.
Well, actually, can everyone hear me?
No.
I think, Sue, in your response, you've sort of partially answered my question, because I was really struck by you saying that there was one term where we have this kind of homogenisation and hegemony of the term that would have so much conceptual muddiness. It made me think of Lord of the Rings with kind of Sauron syndrome, one term to rule them all and one term to bind them. So we're against homogeneity, but at the same time, at an individual level, as the world gets more complex, humans are searching for certainty. And so these kinds of muddy concepts create those boundaries around which people can actually understand and position their own action. And so really for me it was like your reading was initially quite negative around chaotic concepts, but how does that relate to some of the literature around boundary spaces and interpretive flexibility that give people the means to actually make sense of their need for certainty in a very complex world?
Just a signal, not that he's going to run a bit. Ken Gibb was talking in the earlier session about both the values and the limits of the comparative, I guess, in that context of what, in terms of thinking about dwelling and housing internationally, which I suppose is not unrelated in a way, but Susie, not.
Yes, and I mean for me it's a little bit like leadership, or possibly something like parenting, about which I know nothing. I mean it's that tension between having a structure, having a form, having certainty, having predictability, having the ability to be comparative on the one hand, and to agglomerate. At this very same time as you are responsive, reflexive, innovative, and not arrogant. I mean, I think so for me, just to go back to Alex's point, what for me has been so astonishing coming out of studying the African city is how extraordinarily arrogant urban theorists have been. Not wrong, arrogant. And I think that's, how do you accommodate that? I have no idea.
Nick, going on your left.
Yeah, Nick Manning from King's. It does fit a bit with the sort of things I was saying in the last session, and particularly that word arrogance. I think the trouble with in response to the speaker at the back about having usefully concepts that many people can relate to is that the question, to paraphrase Ray Park, is whose concept is it? Because people with power push their concepts on people who haven't got power and say this is the way to look at things. And I think we have to, I very much warm to your idea of trying a bit more conceptual rigour and about what we're talking about, so that we can't be pushed around by fashion or indeed by concepts which happen to be very convenient for some people in the city and not others.
Thank you. Oh, two. Sorry. And I guess following on from Nick, if you're more intimately, empirically orientated, you can't fall into these traps. Or if you're, I was just thinking as you were talking about a student coming to ask me about an area I know very well in Manchester, which has had a huge regeneration process, and he had his questions written down, like what do students do, and his first question was, is this a revanchist project? So I said, well, maybe you should go there, was my first thing, go to walk around Salford Quays. And he said, no, you don't understand. The revanchist project is one where, and I was like, I know what a revanchist project is. What I'm saying to you is, maybe you should go there. And I just thought, people get, it's really common, right? Like, we all do it. You read it and you think, oh yes, this explains everything. I'm off to go and find it. I'm going to go and find my revanchist city, and I'm sure it is. It's really brutal and nasty, and I'm going to write it up, and everyone will pat my head. It's complete opposite to humbly go where you want to go, ask what's going on here, why do we do this and not that? Where is the tension, where is the flexibility, where is it formal, where is it informal, how much play is there in this, why is this the way it is? And in a sense it's almost like reversing our and I really welcome your point about this isn't atheoretical, this isn't just let me slot into your matrix policymaker and I'll do this little square. It's like a really quite radical transformation of how we engage with place or does that make sense?
Okay, well, has anyone else got any pressing comments? We've got time for one comeback from the panel. Any last questions from anyone else? If not, maybe last words across the panel that I guess partly trying to tie us back to what we're not in a parlour game fashion, but trying to think about the spectrum of values through which we make visible our future city. What spontaneity offers? How useful is it? Is it not useful? Is it the ways in which it might be useful? Obviously, there have been implicit reflections on that from all three of our speakers, I guess. But last couple of questions, but also maybe just a last word on coming back to the measure of worth that is the spontaneous. Think about its own value. If you come this way, did Malik?
I just think we have to be careful about what we're referring to in terms of the spontaneous. Because often the spontaneous is attributed to units of analysis and units of enactment and units of being in the city, the more than one and less than two, that are themselves particular kinds of modes of measurement, of calculation, of deciding, of thinking. And that spontaneity becomes both a kind of form of valorization, but then dismissal and occlusion in that process. And so it raises the question about what are the kinds of useful techniques of coordination, coordination, of deciding, of governing. I'm worried. I mean, when Fred Moten says, "I did not consent to be a single thing, a single being," what he's saying by that is that in some ways the notion of individual rights, and citizenship in this city is predicated, the self-reflecting subject is predicated on long histories of stolen labor. And in some ways, are there modes of governing that somehow think more about the coordination and the translation upon multiple vernaculars, multiple repertoires of enabling people to pay attention to each other, to take each other seriously, that somehow don't rely upon these kinds of notions of the citizen and a kind of univocal voice of government, like single policies that hope to, in some sense, address the kind of multiplicity of things going on within the urban region. But the sense of what does it mean to coordinate?
Yeah, I think it's the main argument I put is spontaneous development differs between different places and over time, but it's common everywhere. They have this phenomenon. I also feel researchers focus on slums may not necessarily get the right solution for the slum. Researchers focus on the posh city areas may not get the best solution for the posh area. So what we need is a more comprehensive understanding of the emerging economies, cities, and to have a more systematic study of the internal structure of the city, the rich and the poor, the spontaneous and the planned. So only when we have a more full understanding of the city, we can say what is a good city and what is the right combination. I think that is also it's the project we are just started, and we are looking at 14 cities across 7 countries, and through a major Global Challenge Research Fund project, we are looking at the city systematically using the neighborhood as an analytical unit to see what kind of social, environmental, economic, public facility combination produce the good living environment for the poor, for the middle income, for the rich in different countries, and taking content of the political, cultural, geographical influence. So I don't have much to say at this point, but that is maybe down the road, 3 or 4 years, we'll have more things to say.
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, I actually don't have anything to say at the end, but what I did want to say was thank you, and the reason is that it part of this, there's a provocation, and the provocation disrupts how you think about what you do, and whether what you think is the right or the wrong thing to do, and I've been left kind of with scratchinesses in my own head about kind of what does this kind of conversation mean? You know, where do you take it and why, and what does it make you reflect on? And I think that's really useful from a collective gathering. So thank you, and thanks for the comments.
So we just thank the speakers and then almost exactly in time.